In my opinion, one of the most exciting moments in human history was the period of disunity in ancient China. Many people know this period by another name, the Three Kingdoms, based on the three primary states of China at the time, the Cao Wei, the Shu Han, and the Eastern Wu. This was a period of nearly 100 years of constant fighting at the end of the Han Dynasty, sparked by an event called the Huanjingxi Luan, or Yellow Turban Rebellion. This is the event we'll be talking about today. My name is Tyler, and I want to thank you for tuning in for the first episode of my new series, The History of the Three Kingdoms. While the period of disunity officially took place between the years 2020 AD and 2080 AD, its roots can be seen as far back as 88 AD when Emperor Hahudin took the throne and reigned from 88 to 105 AD. During his 17-year reign, the Eastern Han's power began to weaken, and the land fell into a deep depression due to both political and economic issues. The Han's power really began to fail due in part to the fact that many of the Han emperors came to power while they were still children, meaning that power would be usually handed over to an older family member until the emperor reached maturity. Sometimes these relatives would attempt to keep the power they'd been given, meaning the young emperors would have to make deals and alliances with older officials and eunuchs to gain back the power of their throne. This was during a time when constant infighting between the imperial families and the eunuchs was a massive problem for the Chinese government. In fact, the fighting had become so severe during the reign of both Emperors Huan and Emperors Ling that officials began to openly protest against the eunuchs, who they believed began to take power for themselves and weaken the throne. There were at least 3 major protests, with the first 2 being horrible failures that ended with many scholars and officials executed by the eunuch-manipulated emperors. The citizens of China became scared to speak out against their failing government or the local rulers who used the sorry state of the Han Empire to seize local land for themselves. China was falling into a dark place, being led there by political turmoil and being cemented there by a large series of natural disasters. Such disasters are what led way to the rise of the Yellow Turbans. Early in the year 184 AD, Sheng Jiao, the leader of a Taoist group, Taiping Jiao, or the Way of Supreme Peace, began to rally its members into an open rebellion against the corrupt and failing government. Citizens from all over China began to flock to their side, and soon their rebel forces were in the hundreds of thousands. They even had as many as 35 bases throughout China, each filled with 6,000 to 10,000 men, much like a military. They were filled with a nearly religious passion to take back their government from the man who they believed no longer to be divine, in order to bring prosperity back to their land. The motto of the Way of Supreme Peace was Sheng Qing Yi Su, Huan Qing Tang Li, Shu Ze Ga Su, Tai Ji Da Ji, which roughly translates out to, the azure sky is already dead. The yellow sky will soon rise, and in the year of Jishi there will be prosperity under heaven. The primary reason for this uprising was a land management or irrigation issue. Large-scale famine was ravaging the farms in northern China, forcing many settlers to move south in the search of food. Unfortunately, the south wasn't much better due to landowners exploiting their workers to amass personal riches. During this, the peasants still were forced to deal with an extremely high tax rate to help pay for fortifications along the Silk Road, which were a series of trade routes that connected Asia with Eastern and Western Europe, as well as military garrisons along their borders. It was around this time that landowners, poor peasants, and former soldiers began to band together into small mercenary groups and eventually became their own private military force, under the Yellow Turbans. It was at this moment that the Han government was at its weakest. Landowners began to seize power for themselves amongst the peasants, while the 10 most powerful eunuchs, simply known as the Shi Tong Shi, or 10 attendants, continued to manipulate the emperor into doing their bidding. The citizens of China all but completely distrusted their government, thinking it was too weak and too feeble to deal with the famine and floods that were ravaging the land. These natural disasters became so frequent and so damaging that it actually led people to believe that Emperor Ling had lost his mandate to heaven, which meant he was no longer a just ruler or the son of heaven, and the title should be handed to someone who was more kinder and more just. The scariest thing about the Way of Supreme Peace's plan was what they called a new beginning. It was a plan to rebuild China from the ground up to be a more prosperous and fair land under the teachings of Taoism. In the build-up to the uprising, Sheng Qiao sent out his religious disciples to gain support amongst the disgruntled citizens in northern China. It definitely didn't hurt their message that during all this, the people of China were dealing with droughts and plagues, and all the while were completely abandoned by their government. Sheng Qiao's reach even made its way into the imperial court, where people openly schemed against the emperor, but no one said anything. Unfortunately for the Taiping Jiao, the plan was found out, and the rebels within the Chinese capital of Liaoyang were rounded up and executed, thus beginning the revolt ahead of time. In 184 AD, a disorganized armed revolt broke out across China, where tens of thousands of men rose up against the Han dynasty, forcing the imperial army immediately onto the offensive. The first months of 184 saw almost nothing but large-scale victories for the rebels, with one of the major highlights being the rebel general Sheng Manchua killing the Grand Administrator of Nanyang. However, around the 5th month of 184, the imperial commanders Hong Song and Chu Jin combined their forces to defeat the rebel general Bo Kai, which had all but stopped the expansion of the rebels. After the defeat of Bo Kai, the imperial commanders once again split their troops and began to fight the rebels on two fronts. It was during this a newly appointed Grand Administrator of Nanyang tracked down, defeated, and killed Shang Manchua. However, during the fighting, the rebels were able to capture the capital of Nanyang, where they took refuge. For the last months of 184, the majority of fighting took place around Nanyang's capital city, Wuhan. However, it wouldn't be long before the city was finally stormed and the last of its rebels were slaughtered. This would be the last massive loss for the Yellow Turbans, for their allies in the north were killed by summer, and Sheng Qiao and his brothers were all dead. The rebellion was all but over. For the next several months, any remaining rebels were hunted down and exterminated. On the 12th month of the Chinese year, the government ushered in a new era of Shangping, which translates out to pacification achieved. Though the rebels were defeated in February of 185, the peace only lasted for 2 months before another rebellion broke out. The Second Turban Rebellion spread its way across northern China from the years 185 to 192, when the mighty commander Cao Cao forced the rebel army to submit to him. 10 years later, the rebel army was no longer seen as a challenge to any military. In the end, the Han military was able to overcome a massive rebellion in a remarkably quick fashion. However, the damage had already been done. Many government buildings were destroyed, leaving many districts without the ability to contact their central government. The rebels lost their lives in the hundreds of thousands, and the economy of the most populous region of China was in shambles. Many people were left homeless and starving and suffering from a multitude of diseases. And all the while, bandits began to spring up in every part of the empire, knowing full well the government couldn't stop them. It took many years for the government to win back any sort of trust in its people, and it wasn't that much. The worst of it all was, however, that the military leaders and local politicians once again used the weakened state of the empire to gain the ability to self-govern. This would lead to the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 2020. This was an event that took place 35 years before the fall of the Han Dynasty, but was, at least in my opinion, one of the first dominoes to fall, leading to the collapse of an empire. Also, a fun little fact here is that during the Yellow Turban Rebellion, Liu Bei, the leader of the Shu, Cao Cao, the leader of the Wei, and Sun Jian, the leader of the Wu, were all generals working together with the Han Empire. Who would have known that only a few years later they'd be waging nearly 60 years of war with each other over control over Chinese land?